What happens when certainty begins to crack? Not with a grand collapse, but with something quieter. A bone lifted from frozen ground, a footprint pressed into ancient ash, a mechanism turning beneath a layer of salt and rust. History often reaches us in clean lines. In school books, in museum labels, in the confident voice of expertise, the past is arranged into tidy sequences. First this happened, then that. This species vanished. That technology had not yet been imagined. Human beings, we are told, moved forward step by step, from darkness into knowledge, from simplicity into complexity. But the Earth has a different habit. It keeps fragments. It hides them in ice, in mud, in canyon shadows, beneath the sea. And sometimes, after centuries of silence, it gives one back. This is a story about those returns, about discoveries that did not merely add detail to what was already known, but disturbed the frame itself. A sailor whose frozen body suggested survival beyond accepted limits. A fish that seemed to arrive from a vanished age. Footprints older than the story designed to contain them. Trees thought lost, still breathing in secret. Ancient tools, maps, skulls, stones, and machines that asked an uncomfortable question. How much of what we call knowledge is really only a pause in our confusion? These stories are not arguments against science or history. They are reminders of what those disciplines are at their best. Not monuments to certainty, but living acts of revision. Every honest discovery contains a measure of humility. It tells us not only what has been found, but how much has been missed. And so we begin here at the edge between confidence and wonder. Because the past is not finished speaking. And perhaps the deeper lesson is not that we were lied to, but that truth itself is often larger, stranger, and more human than the versions we learned first. How long can a human being endure when the world has already decided the ending? The question hangs over the Arctic like breath in winter air. In 1845, two British ships entered the polar north in search of the Northwest Passage and disappeared into one of history's coldest silences. For generations, the story was told in blunt, familiar terms. The ice trapped them. The men weakened. The expedition failed. It became a lesson in the limits of ambition and the cruelty of nature. Another chapter filed neatly under disaster. Then, more than a century later, the dead began to speak. On a remote Arctic island, researchers uncovered the preserved body of one of the sailors, held in frozen ground as if time itself had paused beside him. His face was still recognizable. His clothes still clung to him. Even his organs, sealed by cold, carried the record of a life that had lasted longer than experts once believed possible. The old assumption had been simple. Once the ships were abandoned, the men could not have endured for long in such conditions. But the evidence suggested something more difficult and more human. They had not simply vanished. They had struggled on. What emerged from the examinations was not romance, but endurance. Signs of starvation, disease. Poisoning, perhaps, from the very canned food meant to preserve them. And yet, even inside that ruin, there was proof of persistence. They walked farther, lasted longer, adapted more fiercely than the textbooks had allowed. This is what history sometimes forgets when it becomes too orderly. It can measure temperature, distance, and supplies, but it does not always know what desperation can make possible. The body has limits, so does knowledge. But somewhere between them lives the ancient, stubborn instinct to continue. And perhaps that is why these frozen remains still move us. Not because they solve the mystery, but because they remind us that the line between impossible and endured is often drawn too soon. What does extinction really mean if something lost to deep time can still rise from the sea? The answer arrived not in a laboratory, but in the nets of a fishing boat. For millions of years, the Coelacanth existed only as a fossil, its thick scales and peculiar fins preserved in stone. Paleontologists believed it had vanished alongside creatures of a much older world, a relic of evolutionary history with no living future. It occupied a comfortable place in the human imagination, proof that time closes its doors, that some branches of life end and never return. Then, in 1938, off the coast of South Africa, a museum curator named Marjorie Courtenay Latimer was shown an unusual catch. Among the ordinary harvest of the day lay a fish unlike anything expected from modern waters. Its body was armored and muscular. Its fins moved with an almost limb-like structure, as if memory itself had taken on flesh. Scientists soon confirmed what seemed impossible. The Coelacanth was alive. The discovery was more than a biological surprise. It unsettled a habit of thought. We like to imagine the natural world as fully cataloged, each species either present, gone, or understood. But the ocean has always resisted that confidence. It holds darkness not as emptiness, but as concealment. In its depths, life can survive outside the spotlight of human certainty, patient and indifferent to what we think is settled. What made the Coelacanth so haunting was not simply its age. It was the way it bridged worlds. Here was a creature known from ancient Iraq, moving again through modern water. Not a ghost, not a symbol, but an animal continuing its quiet existence, while entire generations of scholars declared its story complete. There is something humbling in that image. A living fossil, we call it, though the phrase says more about us than about the fish. It reminds us that disappearance is sometimes only a failure of sight, and it leaves behind a larger question. How much of reality has been labeled finished simply because it slipped beyond the reach of our attention? What if the first story we tell about ourselves is the one most likely to change? Few ideas have shaped human identity more deeply than the question of where we began. For much of the modern era, the timeline of human migration into the Americas appeared settled. Small groups, it was said, crossed a land bridge from Asia near the end of the last ice age and moved south through an opening in the glaciers. The theory was elegant, widely taught, and comforting in its clarity. It gave prehistory the shape of a map, a route, a date, a beginning. Then the ground itself began to disagree. In places scattered across North and South America, archaeologists uncovered traces that seemed older than the accepted script allowed. Stone tools buried too deep, hearths whose charcoal whispered of dates far earlier than expected, and most haunting of all, footprints pressed into ancient sediment, as intimate as a breath on glass. Not weapons, not monuments, not kings or inscriptions. Just steps. The ordinary act of moving through a landscape preserved long enough to outlast certainty. These findings did not offer one simple replacement for the old narrative. They opened something messier and more truthful. Human movement may have been earlier, more complex, more varied than scholars once imagined. There may have been multiple routes, coastal passages, forgotten migrations, histories layered atop one another like tide marks on stone. The deeper researchers looked, the less convincing a single tidy origin seemed. That tension matters because beginnings are never only about the past. They shape belonging, they inform identity, they influence the stories nations tell about who came first and how memory should be arranged. To revise such a story is not merely academic. It is to admit that the continent carried human presence long before many of our frameworks were built to see it. And maybe that is the quiet power of those ancient footprints. They do not argue, they do not explain themselves, they simply remain, asking us to consider whether the oldest truth is sometimes nothing more dramatic than this. People were here, and we understood too little of their journey. Can a species be gone if somewhere, beyond the map of ordinary attention, it is still quietly growing? In a canyon hidden within the mountains of central China, that question took root in living wood. For centuries, the Dawn Redwood was known only through fossils. Its impressions had been found in ancient rock across the northern hemisphere, traces of a tree that had once shared the world with climates and creatures long since transformed. Botanists believed it belonged to a vanished chapter of Earth's history, another example of nature's great editing process. The species had flourished, then disappeared. The record seemed complete. But in the 1980s, Chinese foresters and botanists encountered something startling in a remote valley. A stand of immense trees that did not match the modern catalog. Their bark peeled in fibrous strips. Their feathery leaves shifted softly with the seasons. And when the evidence was studied more closely, the impossible became plain. The Dawn Redwood was not merely a fossil, it was alive. There is a special kind of wonder in such a discovery, because it reverses the usual direction of time. Fossils normally speak from absence. They tell us what is no longer here. But a living Dawn Redwood stood as a contradiction to that pattern, carrying the shape of deep history into the present tense. It made extinction feel less like a final sentence and more like a verdict sometimes rendered in ignorance. The tree's survival also revealed how incomplete human knowledge can be when geography, war, and isolation narrow the field of vision. Entire species may persist not through miracle, but through obscurity. Hidden valleys, deep forests, and overlooked landscapes have often preserved what certainty had already buried. Nature does not organize itself around our conclusions. And so the Dawn Redwood became more than a botanical surprise. It became a lesson in humility. Somewhere, while science declared the line ended, the tree kept lifting water through its trunk, kept opening new needles to the light, kept standing through season after season without any need to be believed. Which raises a larger question. How many endings are only names we give to things we have stopped looking for? What if one object, pulled from the sea by chance, could make the ancient world feel suddenly more intelligent, more intricate, more familiar than we had dared to imagine? That is the quiet shock of a machine found where only wreckage was expected. In the early 20th century, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Ankithera descended into clear Mediterranean water and discovered the remains of a Roman-era shipwreck. Statues lay scattered across the seafloor like broken memories. Bronze limbs, fragments of luxury, the cargo of a lost voyage. Among them was a corroded lump that seemed at first too damaged to mean very much. It looked like debris, something to catalog and set aside. But inside that crusted mass were gears. As researchers studied the fragments, a startling picture emerged. The device, now known as the Antikythera mechanism, was not decorative and not simple. It was a compact system of bronze wheels and inscriptions designed to model celestial cycles, track astronomical patterns, and predict events such as eclipses with astonishing sophistication. In modern language, people sometimes call it an ancient computer, though the phrase only hints at its strangeness. What mattered was not the label, but the realization. Minds living more than 2,000 years ago had built an instrument of extraordinary complexity, and history had not fully prepared us for it. The mechanism disturbed an old habit of underestimating the past. We often imagine progress as a straight ascent, as if intelligence accumulates neatly and never slips, fragments, or disappears. Yet here was evidence that technical brilliance can bloom, vanish, and leave only scattered traces behind. Knowledge is not always inherited cleanly. Sometimes it is lost in fire, conquest, accident, or indifference. And later generations mistake the gap for proof that it never existed. There is something deeply moving in that thought. A ship sinks, wood rots, empires fade, salt closes over bronze. And still, after centuries in darkness, a set of gears returns to tell us that the ancient world was not waiting to become modern. It was already full of precision, curiosity, and imagination. The larger question lingers long after the mechanism itself. How much brilliance has history misplaced simply because survival is never guaranteed, even for genius? How old is a map before it stops being a guide and becomes a challenge to memory itself? Sometimes a drawing on fragile skin or paper does more than describe the world. It reveals the limits of what its makers were supposed to know. Across history, certain maps have unsettled scholars, not because they proved wild theories, but because they preserved details that seemed oddly ahead of their time. Coastlines appeared with unsettling confidence. Islands were placed where later navigators would find them. Fragments of older traditions seemed to survive inside newer copies, as if knowledge had traveled through centuries by means too fragile for us to fully trace. A map is never just geography. It is accumulated vision, rumor, mathematics, fear, trade, ambition, and inherited fragments of lost observation. That is what makes disputed cartographic artifacts so fascinating. They sit at the border between evidence and interpretation. A line might represent careful measurement or guesswork refined by repetition. A missing shore may reflect ignorance or simply the damage of time. And yet, every so often, a chart appears that feels too accurate in one area, too strange in another, too layered to fit comfortably inside the standard story of exploration. What these maps often reveal is not secret mastery, but continuity. We tend to imagine discovery as a sequence of heroic firsts, one sailor, one crossing, one dramatic unveiling of the unknown. But maps suggest something slower and more communal. Information moves from hand to hand, culture to culture, century to century. A Phoenician route may echo in a Greek tradition, later reshaped by Arab geographers, copied again by Renaissance scribes. By the time a map reaches us, it is less a snapshot than a conversation already centuries old. And that may be the deeper revelation. The past was not empty, waiting for modern eyes to make sense of it. It was crowded with observers, traders, astronomers, and navigators, all contributing pieces to a world too large for any one era to grasp alone. So when an old map surprises us, perhaps the surprise says less about impossible knowledge than about our tendency to underestimate the long, fragile chain by which human understanding survives. What can a skull change? Sometimes nearly everything. Not because bone can speak, but because it refuses to fit the sentence already written for it. In a cave, on a riverbank, beneath layers of sediment older than memory, human remains are found and lifted carefully into the light. At first glance, they seem to promise answers. Ancestry, migration, adaptation. We want the body to clarify the story. We want it to confirm the tidy sequence already arranged in museums and textbooks. But again and again, the ancient dead resist that simplicity. Some skulls display a mix of traits that do not align neatly with familiar categories. Others appear in places or periods where they seem, according to older models, not to belong. A face reconstructed from bone can look unexpectedly modern. A cranial form can suggest population histories more tangled than earlier theories allowed. And with each discovery comes the same quiet disturbance. Perhaps human identity was never as cleanly divided as we preferred to imagine. This is where science becomes most honest. New techniques in dating, genetics, and comparative anatomy do not always replace one certainty with another. More often, they reveal overlap, movement, and exchange. Populations met, separated, adapted, vanished, and returned in patterns far more intricate than simple diagrams once implied. The deeper researchers go, the more human history begins to resemble a braided river instead of a straight road. That has consequences beyond archaeology. The stories we tell about ancient people often become the foundation for stories we tell about ourselves. They shape belonging, difference, continuity, and so when a skeleton complicates the timeline, it does not merely adjust a chart. It asks whether our categories were ever adequate to begin with. There is something tender in that realization. Beneath the arguments and measurements, these remains belong to people who loved, feared, endured weather, buried their dead, and looked at the same moon we know now. Their bones survived not to flatter our theories, but to widen them. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson. The farther back we look, the less the human story resembles a boundary, and the more it feels like a long, unfinished conversation. What survives when words do not? Sometimes it is not a voice, but a mark, a notch in bone, a pattern on clay, a sequence of cuts that looks almost accidental until someone realizes it may be a form of thought. Among the most unsettling discoveries in archaeology are objects that suggest counting, tracking, or symbolic memory far earlier than scholars once expected. A carved bone with deliberate notches, tablets impressed with repeating signs, tokens grouped in ways that hint at record-keeping before formal writing had fully emerged. None of these artifacts arrive with certainty attached. They do not announce their purpose. They wait for interpretation. And interpretation is always shaped by what an era believes ancient people were capable of. For a long time, it was tempting to divide the human past into clean thresholds. Before writing, there was prehistory, mute, vague, unmeasured. After writing, civilization could begin. But objects like these trouble that division. They imply that long before alphabets and empires, human beings were already externalizing memory. They were making marks to hold time, quantity, season, debt, ritual, or story outside the fragile limits of the mind. That matters because writing is not born all at once. It grows from older habits of noticing and preserving. A repeated scratch can become a tally can become a system can become administration, astronomy, law, inheritance. In that sense, the first archive may not have looked like literature at all. It may have looked like a humble object carried in the hand, ordinary enough to be overlooked, profound enough to reorder what we mean by knowledge. There is something moving in that progression. Before there were books, there were gestures against forgetting. Before there were histories, there were people trying to give memory a body beyond themselves. To mark a surface is to resist disappearance. To count is to believe that what happened should remain. And perhaps that is why these small artifacts feel so intimate across vast stretches of time. They remind us that the desire to preserve meaning did not begin with us. It began the first time someone feared that a season, a debt, a death, or a wonder might vanish unless it was placed somewhere outside the mind and left there for another hand to find. What do stones remember when the people who raised them are gone? Wind passes over them. Rain wears their edges. Grass grows at their feet. And still they remain, asking a question that every age tries to answer in its own language. Who built this? And how much did they understand? Again and again, archaeology has uncovered structures whose precision seemed, at first, out of place in the timeline assigned to them. Massive stones fitted without mortar. Alignments that corresponded to solstices, stars, or lunar cycles. Foundations suggesting engineering skills more subtle than earlier generations were prepared to credit. The temptation, whenever we encounter such works, is to leap toward myth. We imagine vanished super civilizations or secret knowledge beyond ordinary humanity. But the deeper truth is often more interesting and more moving. Human beings, working with patience, observation, and collective memory, have always been capable of more than later observers assumed. Monuments are easy to romanticize because they survive. They stand above the ruins of daily life and seem to belong to a higher order of intention. Yet every ancient structure was also the result of hands, laborers lifting, planners measuring, communities agreeing that certain places should hold meaning beyond the present moment. Astronomy, ritual, engineering, and social trust met in stone. What looks miraculous from a distance often becomes, up close, a record of disciplined human attention. That does not lessen the wonder, it deepens it. To realize that ancient builders tracked the sky, understood seasonal cycles, and translated those understandings into architecture is to see intelligence distributed across a culture, not trapped inside a single genius. These sites challenge the patronizing notion that the past was naive until modernity arrived. In truth, many early societies read the land and heavens with a seriousness we have partly forgotten. And so the stones continue their quiet argument. Not that the ancients were magical, but that they were observant, organized, imaginative, and fully human. Perhaps that is why such places still unsettle us. They remind us that sophistication does not belong to one century alone. It appears wherever people decide that time, sky, and memory are worth shaping into form. What if the most unsettling discoveries are not the grand ones, but the small corrections that quietly change everything around them? A date revised, a layer reinterpreted, a tool found where none was expected. History does not always shift through spectacle. Sometimes it turns on details so modest they might fit in a pocket. Archaeology is full of these moments. A fragment of textile that proves older trade routes. Residue in pottery that reveals unfamiliar diets, rituals, or medicines. Microscopic wear on stone tools showing they were used differently than anyone assumed. Even pollen trapped in sediment can reopen an entire landscape, suggesting climates, migrations, and ways of living that no written source ever recorded. Each discovery seems narrow at first, technical and contained. But together they erode certainty with astonishing force. That is because the past is an ecosystem of meaning. Change one element, and others begin to move. If people reached a region earlier than expected, then trade, language, adaptation, and belief may also need to be reconsidered. If a technology appeared in one culture sooner than thought, then influence may have traveled in ways we had not traced. A single corrected date can unfasten decades of interpretation, not because the old scholars were careless, but because evidence is always incomplete until it is not. There is something deeply human in that process. We often imagine knowledge as accumulation, one brick stacked upon another. Yet much of real understanding comes through revision. We learn not only by adding facts, but by surrendering favored arrangements. Mature disciplines are not weakened by correction. They are defined by it. The willingness to revise is not a flaw in science or history. It is their conscience. And perhaps that is why these smaller contradictions matter so much. They remind us that truth rarely arrives as a finished monument. More often, it comes as a whisper from the margins, asking to be noticed. A shard, a stain, a grain of dust under glass. Enough to say that the world was once more complex than we knew, and may still be more complex than we can bear to admit. What do we do when the evidence remains and the explanation does not? This is the quieter territory beyond discovery, where facts endure but meaning stays unsettled. Some artifacts, fossils, and sites never resolve into a single accepted story. Their dating may be disputed, their function may remain uncertain, their context may have been damaged by time, looting, erosion, or the simple bad luck of survival. Scholars argue, methods improve, new tests are run, and still the object resists becoming fully legible. Not because truth is absent, but because truth is sometimes fractured, scattered across missing pieces we may never recover. There is a temptation, in the face of such ambiguity, to force closure, to choose the most dramatic theory, to flatten uncertainty into certainty because uncertainty can feel unsatisfying, especially when the object itself is so evocative. A mysterious mechanism must have an extraordinary purpose. An unusual burial must prove a sweeping claim. A contested timeline must reveal a hidden world. But intellectual honesty asks more of us. It asks us to sit still in the presence of incomplete knowledge and resist the comfort of final answers. That restraint is not coldness, it is respect. Respect for evidence, for the people of the past, and for the difference between wonder and invention. The unknown does not need embellishment to be meaningful. In many ways, it becomes more meaningful when we admit the limits of what can be said. A broken artifact is not diminished because it cannot explain itself. It becomes a mirror for our own longing to understand. This may be one of the deepest lessons these contradictions offer. Not every discovery exists to close a chapter. Some open a door and leave it open. They remind us that knowledge is not possession, it is relationship. A continuous act of attention between the living and the dead, between question and fragment, between what survives and what remains out of reach. And perhaps that is why the unresolved cases stay with us the longest. No, they do not simply challenge what we know. They challenge the assumption that knowing must always end in certainty. Sometimes the most truthful response to the past is not conclusion, but reverence for complexity. What do all these discoveries leave behind once the headlines fade and the museum lights dim? Not simply corrected dates or revised diagrams, but a different way of seeing the human story itself. Across frozen seas, deep oceans, desert caves, remote valleys, and ruined shipwrecks, the pattern has repeated. We drew a boundary around what seemed possible. Then a body, a tree, a fish, a machine, a footprint, or a fragment appeared and pressed gently against that boundary until it moved. The contradiction was rarely total. The past did not collapse, but it widened, and in widening, it asked us to become more patient with complexity than certainty usually allows. Perhaps that is the hidden thread connecting every case. These finds do not humiliate knowledge. They renew it. They show that science and history are strongest not when they defend a finished picture, but when they remain open to being changed by the next piece of evidence. Revision is not the enemy of truth. It is often the form truth takes when it arrives late. There is something deeply consoling in that. We live in an age that rewards quick conclusions and polished confidence. Yet the deeper traditions of inquiry ask for something quieter. Attention, doubt, care, and the courage to say, we may need to look again. The most meaningful discoveries do not merely tell us new facts about ancient people. They reveal a discipline of humility that the present badly needs. And behind all of it stands a more intimate realization. The people of the past were not crude sketches waiting for modern intelligence to complete them. They were thinkers, wanderers, makers, navigators, survivors. They observed the stars, endured disaster, adapted to landscapes, recorded what mattered, and left traces that still disturb our assumptions. Their lives were not preludes to ours. They were complete worlds. So as we approach the final chapter, one question remains. If the past keeps surprising us, not because it changes, but because our vision does, then what else may still be waiting in silence for the moment when we are finally ready to understand it? So where does that leave us after the bones and gears, the footprints and trees, the maps and stones? Not at the end of mystery, but in a more honest relationship with it. The past does not sit behind us as a finished landscape. It moves as new evidence enters the light. Each discovery in this journey has offered the same quiet lesson in a different form. What we inherit as certainty is often only the best arrangement available before the next fragment appears. A frozen sailor changes what survival meant. A fish returns from supposed extinction. Ancient paths, hidden forests, and precise machines remind us that history is not a straight ascent toward truth, but a long conversation between what is known, forgotten, and found again. That realization can be unsettling. We want firm ground. We want the world to stay interpreted once it has been explained. But there is also grace in revision. To change our minds because reality asks us to is not weakness. It is one of the finest things human beings can do. It means we are still listening. And perhaps that is the deeper human story beneath every contradiction. We are a species forever piecing itself together from traces. We build narratives, test them, outgrow them, and begin again. We look into caves, oceans, archives, deserts, and microscopes, not only to learn what happened long ago, but to understand the kind of minds we must become in order to meet the unknown with dignity. Curiosity is not just a hunger for answers. It is a practice of humility. In the end, these discoveries do more than revise history. They enlarge the moral imagination. They remind us that those who came before us were never as simple as we were taught, and that truth itself is rarely small enough to fit inside first explanations. Somewhere tonight, beneath ice or forest soil, under desert rock or deep water, another fragment may already be waiting. And when it rises, as something always does, the real question will not be whether the past was stranger than we believed. It will be whether we are wise enough to welcome a world that is wider, older, and more intricate than certainty ever allowed.